Okay, so here we are, lesson three, Journey of the Soul, and it is a big pleasure to be here with everyone for our third week. If you stuck around for this long, it means something's going well. So thank you for being here. But in all seriousness, we're going to be having I don't want to say serious. It's not a serious topic, but it's an important topic that we're going to be addressing tonight. Maybe a heartfelt conversation, real life. We may, hopefully not, but it's possible we may touch upon some trigger spots for some people, different moods as we discuss the Shiva process. The last 2 weeks, we've been focusing on the experience of the soul of the deceased. We spoke about how the real identity of a person is their soul, how the soul continues to live on for eternity, how the soul journeys on, how the spiritual connection that those that have passed on have with us are even stronger after their physical passing because their spirit, their ruach, is unleashed. And we were really focusing on the experience of the soul of the deceased, a little bit on our experience, but more on the soul of the deceased. Tonight, we're going to switch gears and we're going to talk about what about us? What about the people that are left behind that have suffered from a tragic loss or a terrible loss? We're left with a gaping hole and we have a void. We want to fill that void because we're missing, and we'll never fill that void perhaps because our loved one is no longer here with us. So that's going to be the topic of tonight's discussion. And hopefully everyone will walk away learning something or a lot of new things and new ideas or even reasons behind traditions. And through learning about this, we'll have greater insight to the meaning of it. And hopefully we should never have to experience this. Everyone here, I believe, has lost parent or parents in their life. But we hope and pray that Mashiach will come and we'll be reunited with all of our loved ones, and everything that we're learning will just be to help us understand the past, and we won't have to use any of this information for the future for ourselves. But on a little bit of a lighter note, they say that there was this man, an old man, Mr. Goldberg. He passed away, and he's in a small little shtetl. They didn't have a rabbi or a synagogue, so they had to get the rabbi from the next town over, which they did. And the rabbi comes, and he has no idea who Mr. Goldberg is. He never met him before, and now he has to give a eulogy. But what does a rabbi do in such a situation? He gets up there and he says, "Oh, Mr. Goldberg, he was such a great person. He was well respected." And someone calls out from the crowd, "Rabbi, no, he wasn't. He was a thief." I was like, "Oh no, what do I do?" So he tries again. "Mr. Goldberg, he was a man of faith. He embraced his Judaism." "Rabbi, no, he wasn't. He didn't keep anything." I was like, "Oh no, is this his funeral? We have to say something nice." So he tries again. He said he cared about his family. He was such a good, and Rabbi, he was a terrible father. What are you saying? It's like, "Oh, you say." So the rabbi says, "Okay, guys, we're supposed to say good things about the deceased. Help me out. Is there anything good we can say about Mr. Goldberg?" And someone calls out and he says, "Oh, his brother was much worse." So when faced with the loss of a loved one, though, it's not so funny, right? We always have very good things to say, very positive things to focus on. There's a saying in the Talmud that even the biggest sinners amongst the Jewish people are filled with mitzvos, just like a pomegranate is filled with seeds. Just like a pomegranate has so many seeds inside of it, every person has a lot of mitzvos to their, that they can claim for themselves. There's always something positive that we can find. So, but when someone is faced with a loss, you can never compare one person's loss with another person's loss. Nobody processes or grieves the same way as another person. Everyone processes their grief and their loss different. Some people bounce back to life quickly or quicker. Some people it takes a long time, and there's no time limit on a person's journey and their own grieving of their loved ones. So there's no normal and there's no expectations, and there are no rules, so to say, that you have to be bound by in how you're grieving for your loved one. But equal to everyone is the beautiful traditions that we have from Judaism, which has a profound impact on the people that are left behind and that are here in this world. So we're going to be focusing on 4 different points or questions for this evening. So our first question is going to be, let's go, oh, here we go. All right, our first question is going to be, why do we mourn the loss of a person? And I'll explain what I mean. What type of question is that? Why do we mourn? Why do we mourn the loss of another person? How should we mourn, and how should we find comfort after experiencing a loss? How, number 3, how do we deal with chronic grief? If a person is stuck, years are going by, and they're still not finding any consolation, they're still, very much grieving, they haven't been able to move on. What are some thoughts or insights from the Jewish perspective that can help a person that's dealing with that? And number 4, what can we do to bring comfort to others dealing with their own grief? So we're going to explore, of course, all this from a Jewish perspective, from Jewish sources. We all have our own personalities, our own way of dealing with losses, with any grief in our life. But Judaism has some very special teachings and traditions, and we're going to look at the reasons behind them, which will be applicable to every single person, no matter how they deal with their particular situation. We're going to turn to, before we turn to our first text, I want to explain our first question that I mentioned, which is, why do we mourn? Well, what do you mean, why do we mourn? We just lost someone. We just lost someone that we loved and we're connected with. Why? What do you mean, why do we mourn? If we think about, though, for a moment, about the first 2 lessons, the last 2 weeks, I'm going to turn this off for a moment here. The last 2 weeks, what did we talk about? We discussed how the soul, the neshama, lives on forever. And not only does the neshama live on forever, it's actually, we can be connected to our loved ones in a greater way after they have passed, because we can now connect to them spiritually. And spiritually, our neshama, our spirit, is our real identity, is who we really are. So based on that information, when someone passes, why do we mourn their loss? We should be great. Now we can connect to them in a different way. Their soul lives on. Their soul is happy. They're in the next world. So from a Jewish perspective, why do we mourn? I know it sounds like a ridiculous question, but if we would have stopped at the end of last week and we wouldn't have continued, someone can look at all that information and say, hey, from a Jewish perspective, we're okay with death because the person is just moving on to the next world. They continue to live. Everything is great. So we have to explore, what is the Jewish perspective on mourning? Why are we mourning? And the question gets even deeper because the Greek philosophers did not believe in mourning. They said, we're people of philosophy, right? And if you believe in our philosophy and you believe in the purpose and the mission that a person has here in this world, a person should strive for death. Not that we want someone should take their life, God forbid, but a person should strive to reach that day because they fulfilled their mission and everything is great. I think we mentioned this one of the other weeks. There was a Jewish commentator who wrote about his Muslim host country that he was living in, how they did not allow certain mourning practices because they said the person has fulfilled their mission. We're not afraid of death. So the Jewish perspective, though, is very different. Jewish perspective says not only are you allowed to mourn for one who has passed, as we all know, it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment that you have to mourn. You're supposed to mourn the loss of a loved one. So there was if we do a little bit of jumping around to text number 3, which is on page, bear with me one quick moment.
87.
I'm sorry?
87.
87.
Thank you. Page 87. There was a philosopher. And do you have any volunteers to read text 3 for us?
I'll read it if you like.
Don, take it away.
I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but Sebes, please relate the following message to Evenus and bid him to be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me by immediately leaving this world, if he were a wise man, if he be a wise man, and not tarry. And that today I'm likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must. Simmias said, what a message for such a man. Having been a frequent companion of his, I should say that as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he's obliged. Why, said Socrates, is not Evenus a philosopher? I think that he is, said Simmias. Then he, or any man who has the spirit of philosophy, will be willing to die, but he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand why, though a man is better dead, he is not permitted to be his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another.
So this is a text from, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Socrates. Socrates, thank you. Socrates.
That's the only one I really know.
Socrates was sentenced to death for challenging all the philosophers in his time. He was unconventional, and he was sitting in jail. And this is a transcript of what he told his students when they came to visit him in jail. Because in Socrates' estimation, a true philosopher is one who seeks death and they're removed from the shackles of the body. There are other Greek philosophers, by the way, which believed in suicide. He did not believe in suicide, but others did believe that suicide is a great thing because, again, you're taking your spirit, you're unleashing it, it's no longer constrained and limited by the physical body. And this is the Greek philosophers. And that's why it's important for us to ask this question, why, and from a Jewish perspective, why is it important? Should we mourn? Should we be mourning the loss of a loved one? And the answer is absolutely yes. We do not go in the path of the Greek philosophers. Why? Because we believe, we'll explore why, but we also, of course, we believe very strongly in the value of life, as we did address and speak about last week. Jewish law. So first, we're going to go into what Jewish law says about mourning, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper into the why we mourn and the reason behind the mourning practices in our tradition. Any questions before? I'm sorry, go ahead.
You're not going to use the Socratic method.
No.
Well, didn't he have to drink hemlock? But he was condemned to death. It wasn't something that he wanted to do.
Correct. So he did not believe in pursuing suicide. Other Greek philosophers did. He was condemned to death. He was a nuisance. Nobody wanted to deal with him, right? He was challenging everybody's way of life and way of thinking. So they said, all right, instead of debating him, let's get rid of the problem. So let's take a look at the Jewish perspective, the Jewish law, and after we take a look at Jewish law, then we'll be able to understand in a deeper way why that is the law, why that is the case. So let's take a look at text number 4, right over on the next page, 88. This is from Maimonides, from the Rambam. Rambam says it's a biblical command to mourn the death of our next of kin. We'll take a look at who next of kin is in a moment. But why is that? Why do we believe, unlike Socrates, thank you. Mr. Wormbrand, you didn't cover this in 8th grade.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We covered it at the University of Chicago.
Thank you.
We used the Socratic method.
For some reason, we were focusing only on the Talmudic philosophers. So the Rambam tells us we have a biblical command, a mitzvah to mourn our loved ones. And if we take a look at text 5a on page 89, Ramban Nachmanides says, the Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and that they're journeying away, even if they are alive. So the Rambam says it's a mitzvah to mourn the death of a loved one. Nachmanides, Ramban says, why? Why does the Torah take a different path? Perhaps, if based on everything we learned the last 2 weeks, we shouldn't be so sad. We should be happy for the person. They've completed their mission here in this world. Like Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, who was crying on his deathbed. His student said, why are you crying? He said, I'm crying because I can no longer do a mitzvah. But he knew that his soul is going to continue to live on. So why can't we focus on the soul living on, that connection that we have? And if we cry, perhaps we're saying we don't believe that the soul continues to live on. The Ramban Nachmani says, no, it's not a contradiction. You can have those beliefs, know that the soul continues to live on, but you have to acknowledge reality. You have to acknowledge that the person, us, that are left behind, we're sad by the physical loss of our loved one. And that's why the Torah doesn't say you're not allowed to cry. Because you have to deal with reality. Reality is that it's a sad experience for a person, and let them cry. Okay, that's good. But Rambam, on page 90, text 5b, takes it a step further. The Rambam says like this. He says, mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil, just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of light-headed activities. So what would you say is the difference between these texts? What is the Rambam adding that we don't have in the last text?
That you should cry because of the turmoil you're going through.
Okay, so that's true. So if we would be in yeshiva, we'd be studying these two texts, we'd say, okay, we have text 5a tells us you're allowed to weep. What is text 5b adding that text 5a doesn't tell us?
It's a catharsis.
To
I'm
feel
sorry?
the sorrow. To
One
feel
more
the
time.
sorrow.
It helps the person deal with their sorrow. Where the Rambam says, when you allow a person to mourn and to do the shiva and to grieve, you're actually, it's not just a mitzvah to help a person, it's not just a mitzvah to mourn those that have left this world, it helps the person. When a person cries, it's actually very comforting to the person. So through the mourning, it's not just a useless but natural reaction. There's something very beneficial going on and happening to the person. It's helping them. It's helping them deal with their loss. It's counterintuitive, but the grief is helping soothe the loss that the person has. So far we have two reasons why, from Jewish sources, of why it's important to mourn the loss of a loved one. So we said number one, taking leave of a person brings sorrow. It's a sad experience. That's the reality. That's the natural reaction that we have. So the Ramban Nachmani said the Torah allows us to mourn because that's the reality. We're sad. We have to be saints or angels to focus on the spiritual and be happy for the person and for their soul and to totally ignore our own pain. So Nachmani says we can mourn because we're sad, so let the person mourn. And the Rambam says it's also beneficial to us. It's beneficial for a person to go through the mourning experience, not the mourn. And finally, we're going to have a third explanation, and that's going to be on page 91. And page 91, this is actually a responsa from someone by the name of the Radvaz, who was born in 1479, and he passed away in 1573. And he received, perhaps, maybe it's a judgmental question, but nonetheless, from the question that he received and the response that he gives, we have another perspective from a Jewish source of the reason why we mourn and why mourning is so important. Let's take a look at page number 91. Question: one of this generation's greatest personalities fail to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? So the person saying, there was a gadol hadar, there was a great person who lost his son. I never saw him cry. I don't think he cried at all. And he's asking the Radvaz, he's such a great Torah scholar, he's such a great person. Is that the Torah way? Is that the way we're supposed to behave? So Radvaz answers as follows. Answer. Such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers who maintained that this world is without purpose. By contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, and especially for an honorable individual, is the way of the pious, the prophets, and the individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, and 30 for restrictions on wearing new clothing and getting haircuts, etc. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her, and that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise. So, what's the difference if we take a look at these 3 texts and use our Talmudic glasses for a moment? In text 5a, we said mourning is allowed. Why? Because a person is sad, we'll let them mourn. Text 5b says it's beneficial, it's a good thing. The Radvaz adds something over here, and he says, we're not just allowing the person to mourn because psychological benefits, but it's because of the Torah's perspective of the value of physical life. We're mourning the fact that the person is no longer here with us. They're no longer able to be active in this world, to fulfill the mission for which they were created. Going back to Rabbi Judah, who was crying on his deathbed. The student said, why are you crying? Because I can no longer do a mitzvah. I can no longer do good. I can no longer be of value and add to society. So, unlike the Greek philosophers, Judaism places such a strong value on life here in this world. When it comes time to mourning the loss of a loved one, it's not just that, okay, we'll let you, you can mourn. We'll do the Shiva and we'll have our mourning practices because it's helpful for a person, but it's because we really value the time that the person had here in this world. This bottom line is the soul is no longer in the body, so we're mourning its loss, and that is a valid reason. So it's a nuanced approach, right? So everything we said in the last 2 weeks is true, and the soul continues to live on, and it's unleashed and it's no longer constrained from the body, but we still have a mandate to mourn the loss of a loved one. And a person can say, oh, why am I mourning their loss if their soul's in a better place? We say, no, you shouldn't think that, and therefore it's actually a mitzvah to mourn the loss of a loved one. Okay, any questions? So I want to draw your attention to page number 92, because the Rambam, you remember in text number 4, said it's a biblical command to mourn the death of our next of kin. So the question is, what is next of kin? Now, this doesn't mean that you're only allowed to mourn the loss of a next of kin. It means that the obligation to mourn the loss of another person is on the next of kin. So, and there are different levels of mourning based upon the relationship that you have with the deceased. So the rules of mourning, which we'll get into the details of what those rules are in a little bit, they're limited to somebody which lost their father, their mother, a sibling, a spouse, a son, or if God forbid someone loses their son or their daughter, those are the people that you would be obligated to mourn for. And we'll get into the the laws of the mourning a little bit later on in the lesson. I will note that there is a difference in Torah law between the mourning of a parent and anyone else. We have a mitzvah in the Ten Commandments that we have to honor our mother and our father. So part of the honoring our mother and father is that there are different aspects and elements of the mourning that extends for a full 12 months, which does not apply if somebody loses a child, God forbid, a sibling or a spouse. Those limitations are not in place. And the main limitation would be that during the 12 months after someone loses a parent, they're not allowed to go to a joyous, festive event. That would mean if you're invited to a wedding and you're within the 1 year of the mourning of your parents, you're a little bit stuck. You can't go to a wedding. Now, what do you do, by the way? I had this at my own wedding. There was someone that I grew up with in my shul, and he was like, my father's right-hand man. He was the gabbai, and I was best friends with his son. We grew up together, and he very much wanted to come to my wedding. And he went from New York to Michigan, and he only came into the wedding hall for a very short period of time. He ate outside because there was live music playing, and you shouldn't be at events with live music during the year after a parent passes away. And the loophole or the workaround to him being at the wedding was that there's two things that you can do. Number one, you can be a wait staff. So you can actually go and serve food. So you're not there to party, you're there to help. And another thing is, how can he dance? Well, he can only dance if I would call him into the circle and ask him to dance. Then a bride and a groom are compared to a king and a queen. If they want you to come and dance, you can't turn them down, and that overrides their mourning. But I'm sharing all this because when someone's mourning the loss of a parent, there are more restrictions because of the extra respect that one is commanded to have for their parents. So it's interesting that the longer mourning period is not necessarily connected with saying that this is a greater loss, right? We can argue what's a greater loss. So I don't know if we can argue. Every person, for every person it's different. But the reason that there's that differentiation is because of the special mitzvah of honoring your loved ones. Okay. So as a recap, Jewish law guides us through the mourning process. There are specific laws of what we're supposed to focus on during different days. We mentioned it last week. We mentioned it briefly in one of the texts. The first 3 days of the Shiva is a time of weeping, a time of crying. And the next few days is a time of mourning. And then there's different time periods of what we do throughout the mourning process. Now, that doesn't mean that if someone is weeping and crying on day number 4, day number 5 of the Shiva, they're not allowed to cry. What it means is that the person should try to push themselves to move along and to the mourning process and but nobody's rushed, but it's just telling you what to focus on. If someone on the first day or second day of the Shiva, they're happy and they're joyous and it didn't hit them yet, well, Jewish law is telling you, this is a time of crying. If you're happy, maybe you're not facing reality, and it's a good idea to try to align yourself. But it's not saying that you must cry for this amount of time. It's telling you what the focus should be. But again, every person has their own path and their own way way that they grieve. Something beautiful about Shiva, yes, beautiful about Shiva, is how beneficial and helpful it is to a person. I heard a story of someone which grew up in Yehupitzville, and there were 2 Jewish people, and the husband told his wife, I'm forbidding you from holding a Shiva. After I pass, I want you to, just move on. I don't want you to have a Shiva. And her husband passed away, and they had the funeral, they had the burial, and she goes back to her home, and she's going around in circles. She doesn't know what to do with herself. and she couldn't have a shiva because her husband said he doesn't want to have a shiva. And she was so angry at her deceased husband for not allowing her to have this opportunity to grieve and to share her grief with others. And she was a speaker. She had a speaking engagement planned, so she just went ahead with her speaking engagement, continued life. But what happened was that when a person does that, everything gets bottled up. So we're going to see that the Jewish practices and traditions, they weren't created for the psychological benefit of a person. I don't believe that's why they were created. However, I do think that by following all of the traditions that we're going to speak about, it helps a person tremendously. There's actually a book written, and we're not going to have a chance to go through all of the texts, but on page 96, we're not going to go through it together, but there is a Dr. Rubin is a psychologist who put together he put out a book explaining the relationship between the Jewish timeline and the Jewish traditions of mourning and how that relates psychologically to the person, to their grieving, and how that really helps a person. So everything aligns and really fits very well. So I'm not saying that the reason we have a shiva is for the psychological benefit of a person. We spoke about it last week that there's different there's different time frames for the journey of the soul, and that's the reason why we have the shiva or we have the shloshim and the 7-day mourning period or the 30-day period. But everything does align very well and perfectly with helping a person psychologically dealing with their grieving. So right now, what I want to share with everyone is different time periods, and when it comes to the mourning of a loved one, what those different time periods mean according to Jewish law, what different restrictions are, and what the focus should be during those times. And I imagine that this one right up here on our screen is going to be new for most people, or everyone. The first time period is called Aninut, which means the time period between the passing of a loved one until the actual interment takes place is called Aninut. What does Aninut means? What is this? This is a very strict time and a very focused time. It's a time where the person's pain is so raw. We have a Jewish teaching. You shouldn't console a person when they're looking at their loved one, at their deceased bodies right in front of them. Don't try to comfort them. Don't try to offer any consolation. The person is looking at their loved one. Their body hasn't been buried yet. It's not a time to comfort them. It's a time to accept the reality. It's a time to grieve. It's a time to be sad and to focus on that. There's no attempt at consolation that's being made. And I personally struggle with this when I do funerals. After the eulogy, at some point, it's always very tempting to throw in a few words of comfort to the family, which is grieving so terribly. But Jewish law says, don't do that. They're grieving, and let them grieve. This is the time to let that raw pain be there, and don't try to change that. It will be insensitive to do that to a person when there's such a time of loss to try to offer words of consolation. And because of this strong focus that the mourners have on their grief, they are actually absolved from mitzvos. Now, they're not absolved from all mitzvos. They're not allowed to rob, they're not allowed to steal or do any of those transgressions, but they're absolved from positive commandments. They're not allowed to desecrate the Shabbos, but they're not commanded to make kiddush and eat challah and celebrate the Shabbos. They are actually not allowed to put on tefillin. If someone has a relative, a next of kin that has passed away, and there's a day or two before the burial, during that time period, it's forbidden for the mourner to put on tefillin, because when you put on tefillin, you're focusing on Hashem. Right now, until your loved one is buried, you have to focus on your grief and your sadness. And that's a very big deal for Jewish law to say that you're absolved from all the mitzvahs. That's how strong and intense this period, this time period is. So this is obviously the most intense part of the grieving process. And we're going to talk about the Kriya a little bit later, more at depth. The immediate family members tear a part of their outer garment. And we'll talk about the reason for that and how helpful and beneficial that is, and what the meaning of the rendering of the garment is for a person. We have a Shiva, which doesn't come up here on the slide. I'm sorry. But we have the next time period is a Shiva. If you want, you can follow along on page 93. It's a 7-day mourning period, and it commences from the time of the internment. That's when the Shiva begins. So the Shiva, if God forbid, let's say somebody passes away on Monday and the burial takes place on Thursday, the Shiva would begin on Thursday from the time of the internment. And that is obviously a time, like we said before, a time of weeping, a time of mourning. It's a time where the family, the mourners, don't leave their home, and they don't engage in business, and obviously they have visitors, and they focus on their loss. After the Shiva is something we've mentioned a few times. You may have heard the word, like what's the rabbi saying? It's the Shloshim. The Shloshim is the 30-day mourning, commencing with the internment. So what happens between the Shiva and the Shloshim? During the Shiva, you're not allowed to work. You have to stay at home. But after the Shiva, you go back to work until the 30-day mark hits, not 30 days from the end of the Shiva, 30 days from the internment of the person. There are certain restrictions which remain, and those include not buying new clothing. It's not a time you buy new clothing, it makes you happy. It makes you joyous. Okay, if you need new socks, you can buy new socks. Your socks ripped and you need new, that's okay. But we mean don't go buy a new suit, don't go buy new clothing. Wait until 30 days are over. Because that's something which will bring you joy. This isn't a time of joy. You're still mourning the loss of a loved one. It's no haircuts, no shaving, no haircuts. Now, what if your hair is really, really long? I don't know. You got to wait a few weeks, and no festive events. And this applies not only for the loss of a parent, but even for the loss of a spouse or any other close relatives. You can't go to a wedding. You shouldn't go to festivals with live music, because again, this is a time of mourning, and we're not running away from that. We're embracing the time period that we're in. And then there's the 12-month mourning, which the first year after someone loses a loved one, there's a whole year of mourning. Now, obviously, we see that it gets from high intensity to lower intensity. Aninos, that first time period is really, really strong. You don't even do any mitzvahs because of your mourning so deeply, so strongly. And then it slowly, you keep moving along, you keep traveling along. So this time period we mentioned before applies to someone who's mourning the loss of a parent because of the unique mitzvah that they have to honor their parents. One of the ways we honor our parents is by doing something extra for them. So some of the Shloshim restrictions continue, like avoiding festive events. Like I said before, not going to weddings with live music, and that applies for someone mourning the loss of their parent. And the custom is to keep a candle burning for the entire 12 months. So the candle goes out, you get another one, and that is the time. Those are the different time periods for the mourning practices that we have. Any questions before we continue?
I have
Larry, you're muted.
I have no memory of keeping a candle burning for 12 months after my
It's
first.
a custom. It's a custom. It's not, it's not a halacha that you have to do it. Some people have that custom.
Okay.
I'm just remembering back to when my first wife passed away. We didn't have a candle burning for 12 months.
So this would be only for someone mourning the loss of their parents,
Ah,
not for a spouse or a child or a sibling.
I didn't have that for my mother. Now that I think of it.
Again, it's a custom. It's not a command that you have to do. Some
Ah,
people have that custom. Larry, did you want to say something?
I was just saying after 12 months, I mean, I've gone to the cemetery the first year frequently, and I intend to continue that. And I know the soul is not there, the soul has moved on, but yet to me, it's still a comfort. I think it'll be a comfort to continue my visitation.
Yes. So I just want to clarify that there are 5 dimensions to the soul. And even though on the yard site, a person's soul has what we call an aliyah, an ascent, it's becoming more acclimated to its home and its place in heaven, and it's, gotten a room upgrade, if you will, for lack of a better analogy, excuse the bad analogy. But there's a part of the soul which forever remains connected to the body and hovers over the gravesite. So, and that is for eternity. And that is how, when Mashiach comes, there's going to be the resurrection of the dead. And that's why the soul keeps a very strong connection with the body, even after it's moved on and it's left this world and it's at peace, etc., etc. There's still a connection with the body. And when Mashiach comes, the body will be resurrected and be reunited with our loved ones in a physical body. So the short answer to your question is yes, the neshama, the soul is always part of it is always connected to the body, and there's always a strong connection when visiting the gravesite of a loved one. So any other questions, comments?
it's nice living near Shalom Memorial.
Yeah, there's one of the that's why real estate here is so expensive, right? So on the yard site, we have, and this applies whether it's a parent, a spouse, sibling, or child. The tradition is to have the recitation of Kaddish, and we add in Torah study, and we do extra good deeds. We give tzedakah, we study Torah, we mentioned, and we do extra mitzvahs in memory and in the merit of the deceased, and that helps their neshama because they're no longer able to do a mitzvah, and every mitzvah that we do for their merit is beneficial to their neshama, to their soul, which is why, parenthetically, the Yizkor prayer, you may notice, is a rather short prayer, and we say Yizkor three times a year. And what do we say in the Yizkor prayer? We're making a pledge to give charity on behalf of the person that is of our loved ones that have deceased. Now, why are we coming to Shul and pledging to give charity? Why is that important? Because those that have left this world can no longer do a mitzvah. So we are the hands and feet. We are the physical hands and feet of the soul of our loved ones, which are no longer here. So they can no longer, we are their advocates. When they're up on high and it's a special time, it's a yard site, it's a holiday, and the soul wants to be at peace, we are their advocates. And when we do a mitzvah for them, we are helping their neshama, we're helping their soul. And the reason why we mentioned tzedakah in Yizkor is because tzedakah has something different to it than any other mitzvah. And that is, when you give, now with inflation, it's probably a few dollars to somebody, right? You could have bought a loaf of bread with those few dollars. You could have lived with those couple of dollars. And when you give tzedakah and you help someone, you're giving away your actual life. Now, thankfully, hopefully you have a few more dollars, not giving away everything, right? But you're giving away something which you could use to live with. So it's considered as if you're bringing life to another person. It's as if you're giving your life away. And that's why we mentioned specifically tzedakah in the Yizkor prayer. That's something we don't have a slide for. That's actually another important tradition. So I want to mention this briefly. Then we're going to move on to the Kriya, the rendering of the garments. So I mentioned before Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin, I believe, was an Israeli, he was from University of Haifa. He had an observation, if I recall correctly, back in the 1980s. He said up until the 1980s, the psychological study of how people deal with grief and coping with the loss of a loved one, he found we're dealing with two different behaviors. He said one group of psychologists were focusing on the function of a person, and the other group of psychologists were focusing on the relationship. And he was the first one. Today, this is, mainstream and accepted, but in his time, he was the first one to merge these two approaches. So he said one group of psychologists are looking at the function of a person. Somebody lost their loved one. Are they engaged at work? Are they functioning? Are they able to hold their job and make it through a day at work? Are they able to maintain other relationships and other interests and hobbies, or are they losing everything? And another group of psychologists said, actually, when we're looking at grief, we're looking at the connection with the deceased. So we want to know, for example, how is a person managing their grief related not to their function at work, but related to their connection? Are they weeping and crying for weeks and months on end? How are they dealing with that loss? Their separation from the deceased? They're focusing on a whole different area, on not on the person's functionality, but on their relationship. So Dr. Rubin, a psychologist, he brought these two together. And if you look briefly at page 94, we're not going to go through all this. Figure 3.3, he shows how all of the different responses that a person may have, he merges everything together. And as you continue along with the photos, you'll see he did a whole study and he published how the different time periods we just spoke about aligns with the grieving process that a person goes through, both in relationship to their functionality and in relationship to the relationship that they have with their deceased. So this again shows that by following the Jewish traditions, it's not just a mitzvah, we're not just doing something good spiritually, but it's helping a person psychologically deal with their loss. We're going to move on to a tradition called the Kriya. The Kriya is the rendering or the tearing of the garments. This is one of the things that we do before the body is interred. So before the burial of a loved one, during that aninos period, an intense mourning period, there is a tradition where we tear an actual garment. So the black ribbon that some people use today is a more modern American innovation, which was created for people that they're worried about their look. They're worried about, they don't want to tear an actual garment. I once did a funeral and I told the son, he lost his mother, I explained to him the Jewish tradition of the Kriya. We tear an actual shirt or a jacket. I said, don't wear your most expensive shirt to the funeral because we want to do the Jewish tradition of the Kriya. And he said, yeah, I want to do the tradition. I don't want to use. Anyways, we come to the funeral and I take out the razor and we're about to do the Kriya. He says, Rabbi, not the shirt. It's my $200 dress shirt. I was like, didn't we talk about this? Can we do the undershirt? So we did the undershirt. But you can't do the bracha, and that's not the real tradition. The real tradition is to do the rendering of an actual garment that you're wearing. A shirt, if you're wearing a suit jacket, the real way to do it is to really cut the suit jacket and the shirt. So I tend to tell people, if there's a chapel service and you want to wear your suit to the chapel service, great. But then when you get to the graveside, maybe take off your jacket and we'll tear just the shirt. We don't need to rip your suit jacket as well. That's a little hack. But really, the tradition is to rip any of the outer garments, not a sweater, not an undershirt, something that you wear. Now, as you can hear, some people struggle with this. They never heard about this. What is the meaning of this? I don't want to rip my shirt. I don't understand what this is all about. Let me use a ribbon, or let's rip the undershirt. This is embarrassing. I don't want to walk around like this. So I think it's important to take a couple of moments to understand where this tradition comes from and why this is so important and meaningful. So the Kriya, the tearing of the garments, helps a person fully accept their loss. The first reaction that a person may have when grieving, the different steps of grieving, is denial. A person does not accept, they reject the loss, they deny that this loss happened, they can't believe it, and it's natural. That's part of the grieving process. But they run away from the pain. They run away from this. They just can't believe that this is happening. And the rendering of the garments tells us that this loss, it opens up the person to tell them that this is a real loss. And it makes that truth into a reality. So let's take a look at page 97, text number 6, where we have the biblical source for this mitzvah of the rendering of the garments. This is the story of Joseph and his brothers, and let's take a look. The brothers slaughtered, before we take a look at the text, some of you may recall, but here's a brief refresher. Yosef, was one of the 12 tribes. His brothers and him did not get along they really did not get along. His brothers thought that Yosef wanted to kill him. The brothers got together. They said, let's kill Yosef. Make a long story short, they're about to kill him. They ended up selling him as a slave. And now Yosef, who was a favorite child, the brothers had to go to their father and tell him what happened to Yosef. They didn't want their father to send out a search and rescue team and find out what happened. So this is what they did. Let's take a look at the text on page 97. The brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's tunic in its blood. They sent the colored tunic home, and the couriers brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it is your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." And this is what happened. Yaakov, rent his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days. So this is the biblical source for the idea of tearing of the clothing, and it's a powerful expression of the pain and sorrow. And it's a tangible expression of the stark reality of the loss that a person has. So while the initial reaction is to deny and to run away from the person's loss, this is the first moment where a person begins to accept the pain, the real pain that they have, and they have to face and deal with this tremendous sadness that they are dealing with. Let's move right into text number 7 on page 98. This is a responsa from one of the leading rabbis in his time, Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, and he's not like Rashi or the Rambam. He's a leading figure in his time, and he was in the early 1700s. So he wrote this in response to a question that he received. On page 98, Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz states in Halachot Ketano, chapter 116, that mourners are instructed to rend their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. In my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend their garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss. But as we say, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, right? So this rabbi is quoting another rabbi, and he says, this other rabbi says, the reason we tear the garments is to distract the mourner. They shouldn't think about their loss. They should be worried about their ripped shirt, that they're so upset their beautiful shirt is now ripped. This rabbi says, I respectfully and very strongly disagree. The rendering of the garments is to help the person experience the pain, to feel the loss. Only then is a person able to begin the healing and the grieving process. We're not rushing them along, but we're helping the person face the sad reality that they're in. If a person, like the story I shared before, a real story, a true story that I heard about this woman whose husband said, don't do a shiva. I forbid you for doing a shiva for me. Her grief was all bottled up. She was never able to deal with it, and it doesn't make things become better. Delaying and procrastinating doesn't help a person. It makes it more difficult. So it's really a disservice to the person, and the kriya opens up the floodgates of tears that a person may otherwise keep bottled up inside of them. So there's well-researched and documentation about this idea about not about the rejection, the denial of loss, and the kriya helps the person begin the mourning process. Now, we're not rushing a person. We have the Shiva. We kind of, if you notice, we kind of skipped over the Shiva when we're going through the different time periods. The Shiva is a very important process for the person. The tearing of the garments is the beginning of the grieving process for a person. Having the Shiva, having the visitation, having the time away from work to focus on your loss is very important. Life doesn't just go back to normal. The day after you lose a loved one, to be back in the office is detrimental to a person's mental health. So Judaism is very sensitive to this and says you have to take the time to sit the Shiva. Don't feel rushed. Don't push yourself to be back to normal. If we disrupt the grieving process, it doesn't mean that you're healed. It actually only makes it worse. So we start the grieving right away. We start Shiva right away. We let it start and we let it unfold and we let the process begin. Yes, Linda.
I believed in Judaism, you're supposed to bury as soon as possible. So how do they allow 3 days for tears before the Shiva?
Good question. So let me clarify. So first of all, you're right. Because based on what we learned last week about the journey of the neshama of the soul, we do want to bury as soon as possible to allow the soul to go on its journey. We're not going to go into all the texts that we had last week. We want the neshama to not be in limbo. So it is important to do the funeral as soon as possible. Now, we do allow time for family to come. We do allow time for it to be a respectable presence. So we don't say, ideally, in Israel, they'll do the funeral the same day. I was somebody in West Rogers Park that I know lost their father, and they were sleeping. It was 3 a.m. in America, and by the time he woke up, his father was very ill. He thought his father was getting better. He was in Israel. He came back to America. He woke up. His father had already passed away, and they were already in the middle of the funeral in Israel. And he had like 30 or 40 missed calls. But it was 5 a.m. and it was a Friday afternoon, and the Shabbos was coming, and he made it right on time to have a hookup, but they had already started his father's funeral. Imagine, can't imagine waking up to that. So I was actually at his shiva that Friday afternoon, and he was sharing all this. So the answer to your question, yes, we do the funeral as soon as possible because it's beneficial to the soul. If there's a son, a very close relative, which lives, in California, they need to make it to New York. It doesn't take 10 minutes. It takes a 6-hour flight. They need to catch the next flight. So we'll wait. We'll wait for children to come. We'll wait. We'll give it some time for people to gather together so that it should be a respectable funeral. But we try to do it as soon as possible. The 3 days
it doesn't always happen that way.
This is ideally how it should be. During the Shiva, the first 3 days of the Shiva is the time of weeping. Okay. So it's not that you wait 3 days for the funeral, it's during the Shiva period.
Thank you.
When my father passed away, I was in Rutherford, California, Napa Valley. His wife had him buried within 24 hours. I was unable to attend his funeral.
Oh, wow.
It's terrible.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. I wasn't even made aware that he had passed away.
Wow.
So
Hard.
Doesn't always happen the way you would want.
Yeah. So even though we have an emphasis on a fast funeral, children and very close relatives, we do wait for close relatives to fly in and be at the funeral. So yeah, I'm sorry I'm sorry your experience was very different. I'm sorry for that.
Long time ago.
So one of the questions we said at the beginning of the class that we're going to address is how do we move towards healing? We spoke about The mourning, we spoke about why it's important to mourn from a Jewish perspective, how it's mandated to mourn, the different time periods in the mourning, the different restrictions. From a Jewish perspective, how do we move on in the process over here? We have the acceptance, right? We spoke about the tearing of the garment, which is helping us with the natural rejection that we may have and trying to push the person in the grieving process to dealing with their loss, facing their loss. We have the Shiva period, the time of weeping, the time of reflection. How do we move on to healing? And there's no time period. Every person has their own time frame of when they're going to heal. But what are some thoughts that we can share from a Jewish perspective that can help us with the healing process? So a couple of thoughts. We spoke about these, but just taking a look at it from a different perspective is we can think about how the soul is eternal. So even though our loved one isn't here physically, but their spirit is here even stronger than before. So we can think about that. If someone's open, we'll talk about what you can share with another person, but at the right time, that's something after the Shiva, after you had that processing time and you're moving along with your grieving, it's a thought that you can have. You can think about how a person can think about how their relationship with their loved one is here, and it's not limited to the body. Like we said last week, through love and through mitzvahs, we keep the connection going. And the soul of our loved one is in a spiritually uplifted place. So these are some thoughts that we can have from a Jewish perspective that can help a person with the healing process. And if we take a look on page 100, text 9a, you're going to see a very short text. And this is the traditional Ashkenazic text that has been said for thousands of years as our message of comfort to those that are mourning those that are mourning a loved one. And that is, may the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. So, so here's a question. You're going to someone, you're trying to offer them comfort. And what do you say? Forget about me. I'm not comforting you. God's going to comfort you. Why are we all of a sudden putting all our problems on God? We're at a loss for words. We say, oh, God's going to comfort you. Hashem is going to comfort you. So the truth is that there are a lot of messages that we can take from this simple sentence that we say to mourners, that we've been saying for thousands of years. And let's try to focus on this text for a quick moment. So one thing was we're bringing Hashem into the picture because people say time heals. Well, guess what? Time doesn't really heal. There are people that are mourning for years and years and years. So time doesn't heal. What can I possibly, or anyone possibly say to a mourner that can bring comfort to them? You never know if you're going to say the right thing, the wrong thing. Maybe what you're saying you think is helpful and it's really detrimental. What can we say that can really, there's nothing that we can say that can fill the void that the person has. No matter what you say, the void and the loss is still going to be there. What we do say is that Hashem is able to offer consolation. Why is Hashem able to? We use a very unique name of Hashem in this phrase, and that name is Hamakom, the place. There are different names of Hashem, and one of the ways we refer to Hashem is Hamakom, the place. Hashem, who is the place, will bring comfort to you. And a deeper meaning to this is what we're saying is Hashem, who is the place, Hashem, who encompasses the entire world, this world and the next world, and sees things from a different perspective and sees where your loved one is and how peaceful and happy they are, Hashem can bring consolation. We're also saying Hashem did this, and Hashem's the one that's going to have to bring comfort. We're going to have to go back to our faith in order to have comfort and consolation over here, because there's really nothing that we can offer as a human being that can bring comfort, because we're not going to try to explain this or make this any easier. We're going to say we're going to have to go back to our faith. We're going to have to draw Hashem into this picture over here. Why do we mention Zion and Jerusalem? Right? Well, if you go to someone who's mourning the loss of a loved one, say, by the way, not only are you mourning, we're still mourning for the temple that was destroyed. Well, that's not very comforting, is it? Why are we offering that? Why are we telling that to people? So on page 101, we have a letter that the Rebbe wrote to Ariel, or Arik Sharon, which was following the tragic passing of his young son, Gur. And this is the letter of consolation that the Rebbe wrote to Ariel Sharon. In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans, and before them the Babylonians, were given dominion only over the wood and stone, silver and gold of the temple's physical manifestation, but not over its inner spiritual essence contained within the heart of each and every Jew. Over this, the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merrily ascended to the world of truth. So the reason why we're mentioning the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem is to tell us this comforting thought that just like our mourning for Jerusalem is over the physical loss of the temple, that the Romans and Babylonians destroyed the wood, the gold, and the silver, but the spirit is still there. So that's what we're doing. We're offering this thought to this person, to the person that's mourning, that yes, the physical is no longer here, but the spiritual and that connection that you have with your loved one, that will always remain strong and will always be there. So we're going to move on to our video meditation, and let's take a look. I'm sorry, I think I skipped the video. Hold on.
Today's reflection is going to involve an image which
Is everyone
all of us
able to
probably
hear?
have an immediate
Yes.
and strong reaction to. It is an icon for Jewish people all over the world and throughout the ages. An image that when we see it, we have a very strong and almost reflex response. I'm speaking of the image of the Western Wall, the only remaining vestige of the once glorious Holy Temple which stood in Jerusalem and was destroyed 2,000 years ago. We're going to use this image to help us in relating to our understanding of our relationship with those who have passed on. So imagine, if you will, in your mind's eye, the image of the temple, the glorious temple as it stood, as it was built by Solomon in its royal splendor, something that was revered by peoples all over the world. And now, juxtapose that glorious image with the image of the Western Wall as it stands now and has stood for 2,000 years in its destroyed state. Go back and forth between these two images. The temple as it stood in its glory, and the temple in ruins when we only have the Western Wall. The Western Wall is a symbol of destruction. The temple is no more. And yet, think about the hope, the strength, the inspiration, the spiritual and emotional energy that emanates from that image, even when the temple is in its destroyed state. Now think about a loved one who has passed on. Think about them when they were here with us in the physical world. Think about the situation at present. when their physical body is no more? Are they really gone? Have they really lost their influence and power in your life? Or are they like the Western Wall? The Western Wall is an image of destruction, and yet the Western Wall is a symbol of inspiration and hope, pride, powerful, powerful emotions. Think of this image. Think of the feelings that it evokes in you. And now relate this as a symbol to those who are currently, physically, their vessel has been destroyed. But spiritually, their power is as great as ever. We'll take a moment now to reflect and to connect to this image and to relate it to our loved ones.
Would anyone like to share for the group any of your thoughts or feelings? Was this helpful? Was this relatable?
He wants us to feel good that we've had this person. And sometimes it's just hard. Maybe it takes a lot of time to feel good about it after the loss.
To focus on that connection part. Takes time to overcome the sadness and to see how the person is still with you.
Maybe it takes 12 months.
I'm sorry?
Maybe it takes 12 months.
It takes longer. Grief dulls. It never really goes away.
Thank you for sharing. So it's a very raw and personal experience. Everyone has that experience in a different way. Oh, whoops. I want to share. We have a few minutes left, and there's still so much more to uncover, discover, and explore together. We're going to move on to another topic. We have two more topics we're going to cover in the next 10 minutes, and we'll try to give as much as we can in the short time that we have. You know the story of the rabbi who gives his hour-and-a-half long Yom Kippur sermon, and Linda, looks like you know the story, right? After Yom Kippur comes, one of the comes to the rabbi and says, "Rabbi, that sermon was out of this world. It was amazing. I have connections with cable TV. I can get you on cable TV. Rabbi, can you give your sermon on cable TV?" Rabbi says, "Oh, it'll be the best thing, sure." Says, "Rabbi, the only problem is it's very expensive. I can only get you like 120 seconds. Do you think you can send it to 120 seconds?" Rabbi's thinking, it'll be really hard. Yeah. Finally says, "Yeah, I think I can do it." So, Rabbi, why'd you make us sit through an hour and a half, right? Why couldn't you give us the 2-minute version? So we're going to move on to our next section, which is what can we tell a person or ourselves if a person is stuck? They're and again, there's no time period. Torah Jewish teaching doesn't say you must be over your grief within 12 months. We're not putting a time limit, but a person feels that they're stuck. They're stuck in their grieving. They want to move on. They want to be able to live with their loss, acknowledge their loss, but they want to get to the step of grieving called acceptance, where they're able to live with their loss and continue their life. They don't want to be stuck weeping and crying and mourning, for years and years to come. The sadness can always be there, but sometimes a person is just stuck. So, is there any Jewish guidance for this? So what's keeping a person stuck? So at times, these are some of the common emotional reactions. A person can especially be stuck if it's a very tragic loss, if it's a young child, if there was pain, there was a severe illness, if it was unexpected. So the emotional reaction that a person has is much stronger because they feel it's injustice. It's not fair. There's a sense of anger, and the loss cuts deep and evokes a strong sense of anger. Why was this person taken so suddenly or so in such a tragic way? So what can we tell such a person? And what does Jewish values tell us? So we're going to take a look at text number 11 on page 104. And this is a story that happened with one of the most famous Jewish leaders. His name was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he oversaw the Jewish people's transition from the temple era to the temple-less era. He saw firsthand, many people don't know this, by the destruction of the temple, there were many more than 6 million Jews that were murdered. And there was the murder of millions of Jews. There was the sale into slavery of many, many Jewish people by the Roman conquerors. And he saw all of this. And he was a towering figure. He was the leader of the generation, if you will. But then he lost his own son, and he couldn't find consolation. And from all of his thousands of students, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5-star students. And we're going to see in text 11, they all came and they tried to offer words of consolation. And let's take a look at what worked and what didn't work on page 104. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, his students arrived to console him. Rabbi Eliezer entered and sat before him. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Eliezer said, Adam had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that he accepted consolation? For it is stated, Adam was again intimate with his wife. So you should allow yourself to be consoled. Well, it was a nice try. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I'm grieving my own loss? Do you have to make me feel pain for Adam as well? Rabbi Yehoshua entered and asked, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yehoshua said, Job had sons and daughters. They all died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled. So you should also accept consolation. How do we know that Job was consoled? For he declared, God has given and God has taken. May God's name be blessed. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss? Do you have to make me feel pain for Job as well? So Rabbi Yossi entered and sat before him. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yossi said, Aaron had 2 illustrious sons, but they both died in a single day. And yet he allowed himself to be consoled. As it is stated, Aaron kept silent. His silence implied that he was without grievance and accepted consolation. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I'm grieving my own loss? Do you have to make me feel pain for Aaron as well? All right, let's see what happens. Rabbi Shimon entered. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Shimon said, King David had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. And you should allow yourself to be consoled as well. How do we know that King David was consoled? For it is stated, David comforted Bathsheba, his wife. He was intimate with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. So should you, master, allow yourself to be consoled. And as you can guess, Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for King David as well? So Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch entered. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me, and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse. For Rabbi Elazar is a great person and will not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. Meaning to say that once Rabbi Elazar says his comforting words, I will not be in mourning anymore, and I'll be ready to go to the bathhouse and wash up after all this time of sitting here. So he was already prepared that Rabbi Elazar is going to come and say something wise and intelligent. So Rabbi Elazar entered, sat before Rabbi Yochanan, and told him, let me share a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail in fear. Woe is to me, when will I emerge unharmed from this safekeeping role? Meaning, if I don't return this deposited item undamaged, I'm going to have terrible consequences. So every day there's more risk of me failing at my job. You, master, also had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, the prophets, and scriptures, in the Mishnah, the Halacha, the exegetical teachings, the Agada, and he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. Rabbi Yochanan responded, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion. So the question is, why did Rabbi Yochanan fail to find comfort in the words of his 4 earlier visitors? And why was he consoled by the message of Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch? Any ideas?
Well, he was talking about the son, not about others.
So that's right.
Generally, I guess they say when you go to a house of mourning that you tell stories about the person to bring comfort.
Yes.
That they had a meaning in your life or had meaning while they were here.
Right. So the first 4 people they did wrong was they were bringing up the pain of others. Instead, they were comparing. Oh, you lost a son. Aaron lost a son. This person lost a son. You can't compare one person's pain to another person's pain. This applies to other people's losses and your own loss. So if a person goes to a shiva and the person's in pain and you start talking about your own losses, that's not very helpful. The person that's in mourning wants to focus on their loss. And additionally, Rabbi Elazar ben Aruch said something very powerful to his teacher. He was explaining something, he was giving something of substance, something of value. He was giving him something to hold on to that was comforting. He was telling him, every moment in this life is a gift from Hashem. We do our best to be custodians of that gift of life. And there's a sense of comfort knowing that your loved one, your son, lived a beautiful life and that they were blessed to be here and to fulfill their mission in this world. So he was focusing on not someone else's pain, on his own son, Rabbi Yochanan's own loss, and he's giving him a comforting message. So that is one idea, one lesson we learn. There are a few things that are kind of like no-nos to do at a shiva house. If you turn to page 110, we'll go through a couple very briefly, some of the basic shiva protocols, and then I'll share a couple of things that you shouldn't say at a shiva. So we cover mirrors and pictures in the shiva house for the duration of the shiva. And let me get to, so we cover the mirrors and pictures. The mourners remain in the house of mourning. They don't travel. They don't go to the movies during shiva. They don't go to work during shiva. We have a tradition to sit on low stools. I learned that Shalom Memorial actually has low shiva chairs that they lend out. So if you have someone which is going through a shiva and there was shalom, you can get shiva chairs from them. They're very wonderful. No leather footwear. So you would change it if your shoes are leather, change it to non-leather shoes. We avoid listening to music. It's forbidden to listen to live music, recorded music. We should avoid listening to as well. There's no shaving or haircuts. We don't go to work. You actually avoid Torah study. During Shiva, it's not a time to study Torah. Leave it out. It's a time to focus on your loss. So Torah says that normally when you have spare time, study Torah. Every extra minute, study Torah. During Shiva, we want you to focus on what's important in your life at this moment. There are restrictions on bathing, there are restrictions on laundry. The prayer services ideally should take place in the home of the person sitting Shiva. In the case where you can't get a minyan together in the mourner's home, the mourner could go to the shul, but ideally the minyan should take place in the mourner's home. And of course, it's a time of visitation for the mourners. So what should you say when you go to a Shiva house? And it's a trick question.
The less the better.
The less better. Thank you, Don. It was a rhetorical question or sarcastic. You should really say nothing. Text number 14 that the reward for visiting the home of mourning is for the silence. Just being there for the person, that's what is necessary. And the reason why you shouldn't, it's not about you, it's about the mourner. And there's another law, which is in text number 15, the comforters may not say anything until the mourner opens the conversation. You don't know what's going through the mourner's mind, how they want to deal with their loss and with their pain. So you can go in there and start a conversation, start talking about this, that, or the other, and the mourner, you're not only helping them, they're totally uninterested or maybe even painful what you're talking about. So we wait for the mourner to start the conversation, so we allow them to direct and dictate what the topic and should be about and what path this is going to take. So the real thing is you're showing that you're there for them. You don't have to say much. Sometimes people are afraid to go to Shiva houses. Today we have Shiva parties. So sometimes they're very fun, and which is fine. That's meaningful for the mourner, and that's how they're dealing with their loss. So be it. The Rambam actually says that you should give the mourners a few l'chaims, and more than a few, to help them deal with their loss. So everyone has their own method that works for them. Some people it's l'chaims. Some people want to be surrounded by social activity. They just want to be surrounded by life and energy. Everyone has their own little twist of how they want their Shiva, grieving process to be, and we respect that. And that's why we let the mourner open the conversation, and we're just there for them. Whatever they want, that's what we're going to do. And here's a couple of, I know nobody here would do this, but a couple of line items they say not to say at a Shiva house is, were you there when he died? Did she die from the cancer or from the chemo? Did you know in advance or was it sudden? Did he have life insurance? God only takes the good ones. These are all, don't compare losses. These are all very, very obvious ideas. We want to just be there for the person. We follow their lead, and that is the emphasis, both from the Jewish perspective and just from a practical standpoint of what we want to do for others. So if we need to sum up some of the things that we spoke about today, we were focusing on the experience of those that were left behind. We spoke about the real sense of pain that we have, the Jewish perspective of the commandment to mourn the loss of others. It's a process by following all of our traditions, by following the rendering of the garments, the Shiva, the Shloshim. It helps us enter a process to re-enter our lives. We spoke about how to comfort others, what we can tell are things that we can think about if we're stuck in our grief, some ideas to meditate on. And we spoke about some Shiva ideas. And the main idea was not what to say, but it's really what not to say. So I hope that this has been informative, a lot of different details, but going really from A to Z of the mourning process from the Jewish perspective. Next week, we are going to be moving on to a topic that some people find fascinating, some people find it reassuring, some people say this is downright scary, I don't even want to talk about this. And this is not only the afterlife, but more specifically, heaven and hell. Do we believe in heaven and hell? And if we do believe in it, what version of it do we believe in? Where does the soul go? And what is the function and recitation of Kaddish? So I gave some of it away earlier in the class, but there's a lot more to come next week. So we'll take a deep dive into all of that next week. So thank you everyone for staying overtime. Mr. Warmbrand, you stayed awake the whole time. Thank you.
I was getting a little tired, but
Yeah, that's okay. You had a long day. You're an hour ahead of
Right.
us.